Hi, everybody. My name is Dawn Neumann, and I'm really thrilled to be here presenting on behalf of my colleagues, Dr. Sam Backhaus, Beth Helton, Tony Laffoon, and Dr. Flora Hammond, to tell you a little bit about some of the research that we've recently been doing, examining a new intervention that we created to address anger and aggression after traumatic brain injury. But before we launch into that, I just wanted to acknowledge the funding resources for this line of research, which has been funded both by NIDLR and NIH. So why are we talking about anger and aggression after traumatic brain injury? Well, as most of you know who are listening to this presentation already, that anger and aggression are very common after traumatic brain injury and elevated compared to what we see in a neurotypical population. And issues with anger and aggression can be very problematic when one is returning back into the community, and it can negatively impact all aspects, whether it's just returning back to home and reintegrating back with the family, trying to get back to work, but it could also impact social lives as well and friendships. And it could also lead to an increase in criminal activity and even potentially incarceration. The sad state of affairs, though, right now is that there are very few evidence-based interventions for treating anger and aggression after traumatic brain injury. And part of this has to do with the heterogeneity with the different reasons for anger and aggression after brain injury. And so there's a lot of potential mechanisms that have not yet been taken into consideration. And so we really need to do more of an exploration as to what might be contributing to these problems so that we can better treat them. So we turned early on in our research, we turned to the process model of emotion generation and regulation created by Dr. James Gross. And his model basically states that emotional responses are created by various elements, including the situation that one is in, the attention and what somebody attributes their attention to, how they appraise the situation. And this information, these components will contribute to the generation of an emotional response. Now, if we want to alter or modify that emotional response, we can look at any point along this continuum here as potential opportunities for change. And one of the areas that we wanted to focus on is the appraisal area, in terms of helping somebody to create changing their cognitive appraisal of a situation. And this is very much something that cognitive behavioral therapy takes into consideration. But not a whole lot of work has been done to systematically, empirically study that in traumatic brain injury. And when it comes to appraisal, there's all different types of appraisal. We wanted to focus on something called the attribution emotion association. So attributions are an appraisal type. Every time we interact with people, we are always trying to evaluate or judge reasons for what they're doing and why, to understand their behavior. And so common attributions are trying to understand people's intent, and whether or not their behaviors are hostile and how much we blame them. So this picture is depicting a waiter spilling wine on somebody. So in this situation, an example would be, you might want to figure out, did the waiter do this on purpose? Was it intentional? Was there any hostility in his actions? And how much do you blame the waiter for spilling this wine on you? And this association says that the more negative or extreme these attributions are, the angrier you're going to be in response to the situation. And this is very commonly studied and has been studied quite a bit in people without traumatic brain injury. Now, while that's not earth-shattering or anything, I think what is more clinically interesting is negative attribution bias. So this is essentially when somebody they're prone to interpreting situations with more extreme hostility and intent and blame than is warranted for that situation. And so when things are sort of ambiguous, people with negative attribution bias are unlikely to give people the benefit of the doubt. And this has been associated with more aggressive behaviors, domestic violence, social misconduct. And we see this in many different persons with different affective disorders and conduct disorders, and even in criminal offenders. So What's interesting is that this kind of looking to these other populations led us to look at these things and people with traumatic brain injury. And so we conducted a series of research studies which demonstrated that there is in fact an association of these negative attributions of intent, hostility, and blame with anger and aggression after traumatic brain injury. We also found that when we compared people with traumatic brain injury to neurotypical controls matched for age and sex, that people with TBI were more prone to these negative attributions, suggesting they have negative attribution bias. And then we later looked at these potential risk factors that contributed to the likelihood of somebody with traumatic brain injury having these negative attributions. And as it turns out, having trait aggression, but also poor social inferencing appeared to predict more extreme negative attributions. And so we know that, so anger and aggression is a huge problem. We know that these negative attributions are contributing to it. So is there something that we can do to treat these negative attributions? And so that led us to create this intervention that we affectionately call the intervention to change attributions that are negative. We also call it ICANN for short. The study objectives here, essentially, this is an early phase 1 trial, really looking at the feasibility of this intervention. And so this was a randomized waitlist controlled trial to examine this ICANN intervention. And our primary research questions were, one, we just wanted to know what the feasibility was of this intervention by looking at attendance, satisfaction, adverse events. And then we also wanted to know if this intervention would reduce the attributions, how people with brain injury interpreted other people's behaviors. We were also interested in looking at perspective taking, because as you're going to see in a minute, when I tell you a little bit about the intervention, it really is a strong focus on teaching people with brain injury how to use perspective taking to reduce these negative attributions. And then finally and foremost, we were most interested in, was there a reduction in anger and aggression after receiving this intervention? And I do want to just stop briefly and note that this intervention was originally created by a colleague of mine, Dr. Jill Weingartner, who had seen some of our earlier research just demonstrating these negative attribution associations with anger and aggression after brain injury. And she created this intervention, which she had originally called perspective taking. And then more recently, we've evolved into calling it the ICANN intervention, and Jill has been a part of this research as well. So for this particular trial, as I noted a minute or two ago, that this is a randomized waitlist controlled trial. So what we did is it was also a group intervention, I should mention. So what we did was we would screen people to determine eligibility, and essentially we would try to get so many subjects into a particular wave, so somewhere between 6 to 10 participants per wave. And once we would get enough participants for that, eligible participants for that wave, we would then bring them in for some additional testing. That's time 1 testing, and then what we would do after that time 1 testing, we would randomize half of some of the subjects to ICANN, and then randomize other subjects to the waitlist control group. Those that were randomized to ICANN began the intervention pretty much right away. The waitlist control group they didn't get the intervention until after time 2 testing. As you can see, the intervention was 6 weeks long here, and then both groups would get retested. And then after that time 2 testing, the waitlist control group would get the intervention. The intervention itself was 6 sessions, and each session was delivered once a week, and the sessions were about 2 hours long. The first session, we started with some psychoeducational information about brain injury and anger and aggression after brain injury, and what we know about kind of how we are interpreting other people's behaviors and perspective taking in this relationship to anger and attributions. And then every session, sessions 1 through 6, we always did 3 things. One, we started off with ICANN's core principles, which is basically, I can change my perspective. I can change the way I think and feel about people's actions. I can change how angry I get in response to people's actions. et cetera. And then this sort of core principle mantra, so to speak, was followed by two key exercises. One was a role-playing exercise that was done in conjunction with video scenarios that people would watch. So we would show this like 30-second or so video clip of this the situation happening. And it was always sort of an ambiguous situation. And then after watching the video, our participants would have to brainstorm as to why they thought somebody in that scenario reasons for their actions. And then they would do that independently, and then they would do that with the group as a whole and come up with as many ideas as possible. And then together they would pick the most benign reason for why the person would do that. And then they would have to role play these scenarios as the people in the videos with this idea in mind of the benign reason for this person's actions. Then the next exercise that we did is our perspective positioning exercise. And with this exercise, participants had to come to the situation with their own personal scenarios. And they would describe the situation where they felt sort of like somebody wronged them. And they would essentially, as part of this exercise, they would start off in one chair and describe their thoughts and feelings with respect to the situation as themselves in chair A. And then they would shift to chair B. And when they were in chair B, they became the other person in the scenario, taking on that person's thoughts and feelings. And they would shift back and forth, being guided by one of the group facilitators until they essentially, the idea is that by putting themselves in the other person's situation and shoes to sort of encompass that person's thoughts and feelings, it would help them to understand a more benign rationale for why the person did what they did. Okay, so as far as outcomes, we were looking at client satisfaction. We looked at aggression with the Bus-Perry aggression questionnaire. That was our primary outcome. We also used the promise anger measure. We used something called EPS scenarios, which they were these written hypothetical scenarios. And then after each scenario, our participants would have to rate, they would be asked how angry they would be in response to this scenario and how aggressive, and then what their behavior would be. And then they would also be asked to answer questions about how intentional they felt the characters' behaviors were, how hostile the characters' behaviors were, and then how much blame they ascribed to the character. We also measured perspective taking with the interpersonal reactivity index. And then we used something called the global impression of change to evaluate kind of more globally what people thought about changes in their perspective taking and their anger. Here's our inclusion criteria. I'll allow you to read them for sake of time, but for the most part, our participants had to have complicated, mild to severe TBI and be at least 1 year post-traumatic brain injury. And then they also had to score in a particular range on some pre-tests that illustrated that they had above average aggression and also were impaired on negative attributions or had low perspective taking, because we wanted to make sure that the intervention was targeting a problem that they actually had. So here's our flow diagram, and I know this seems maybe a little bit busy to look at, but essentially what we did was we enrolled 24 participants with traumatic brain injury. 10 of those people were randomized to ICANN and 14 were randomized to waitlist controls. We did have a few dropouts, a few withdrawals. So in the end, we ended up with 8 participants in the ICANN group and 13 participants in the waitlist control group, which ultimately means that we did not have enough subjects in both groups to we didn't have enough power to compare those two groups to one another. So what we did ultimately for analyses was we pulled all of the participants, because all of them ultimately did get the intervention, and we looked at the change, the difference from pre-post intervention changes on our outcomes of interest. And I will say some of the challenges with recruitment and enrollment had to do a little bit with COVID. That was always fun trying to do research during COVID, where we had to pause a lot of our activities. Okay, so jumping into the results here, here's the demographics of our participants. As you can see, most of our participants were on average, were in their early 40s. Most of our participants were male and white. The feasibility outcomes of this trial showed that we had good feasibility. 76% of our participants attended 5 or more of the sessions. We have a breakdown of the reasons for missing sessions. We had only 2 adverse events were potentially probably related to the intervention, where people really just didn't like, one person did not like one of the exercises, and another person kind of reported afterwards, kind of continuing to think through the event, that the personal experience event that they had talked about for another day or 2. We had high satisfaction with the intervention, so 90% reported being mostly to very satisfied, and 95% felt that the services they received helped them to deal more effectively with their problems. So then we looked at changes in their negative attributions on those EPS scenarios that I was telling you about. We saw, this is again for the entire group, we saw significant reductions in their attributions of intent and their attributions of blame. The attributions for hostility, we did not actually see a significant reduction in our group on hostility, but we did for the other 2. For perspective taking on the interpersonal reactivity index, we did not see a significant change after the intervention and their perspective taking on this particular measure. But if you actually look at this, this was the global impression of change that I had mentioned earlier. This is the patient global impression of change. And what you're seeing here is that 83% of our participants reported feeling at least that there was a moderate change in their moderate and noticeable change for their perspective taking, which is really quite promising and speaks a little bit differently to what we saw on the interpersonal activity index. As far as anger and aggression, we have had a couple different outcomes for anger and aggression. That Bus-Perry was our primary outcome measure. We saw significant reductions on that. We saw significant reductions in the PROMIS anger, and then also their anger and aggression responses to those EPS scenarios. So really excited to see these changes. And then we also did this global impression of change assessment for anger and aggression, and saw that 45% felt that there was at least, they were moderately better and at least a noticeable change in their anger and aggression. So we had some really great qualitative reports from our subjects in terms of what they felt changed in them, if anything, reporting that they sometimes in certain situations and certain topics that trigger frustration, I've been able to employ the I CAN strategy, more understanding of people, don't jump to conclusions. I'm more aware of other people's perspectives, and have improved on not just reacted and not reacting solely on my first emotion. So really great qualitative reports here as well. With respect to contributions to evidence-based practice, I know that this research is sort of the long game. This is very early on. It's a feasibility study, but I will say that we are addressing a really important gap here, a major clinical need for addressing anger and aggression for people with traumatic brain injury. The intervention itself is built on prior evidence, as I was talking about the process of motion regulation, the findings that we demonstrated associations between these negative attributions and anger and aggression after brain injury, and we are treating some of the risk factors we noticed were contributing to these negative attributions after brain injury. And so we hope that this is really setting the groundwork for structured evidence-based therapy that clinicians can use to treat their patients with TBI who have anger and aggression that's associated with negative attribution bias in the long run. With that, I want to say thank you so much for your time. And finally, just to conclude, here's my email and also a couple related presentations that you can find as part of Care Week. Thank you again.